that we're going to present and discuss before Planning Commission next Monday. A little process and time frame look. And for those of you who may be joining this conversation, I'd like to do the catch up to try to decode some of these issues. The middle housing, otherwise known as the missing middle, is generally a category of homes characterized by duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, and the cottage cluster. Generally considered as a smaller alternative to a single family home, but intended to be compatible in the scale and historically co-located in similar neighborhoods. Our Planning Commission has been discussing the mechanics of a middle housing code since December. And earlier this month, I came to you all as a part of the work session to discuss some of the policy issues related to the code update, specifically parking, and some of the tensions between development scale, compatibility, and marketability. Generally from that, the takeaway was council was supportive of a reduced parking regulation and did express its concern over the gap between some of the middle housing outcomes when compared to our larger and less affordable townhouse developments that are permitted by code today. With that, we took direction from council to look for ways to narrow the gap and incentivize the development of some of the smaller units. Before we dig into the code itself, I have some information that we've been looking at, and I wanted to circle back on something that we had previously talked about in terms of unit sizing. Initially, we weren't talking about a direct unit cap or a size cap. However, as some of the amount of development is growing or opportunity to grow, we wanted to I did recommend a unit cap be installed, and this chart actually explains some of the reasons why. And this is not just a middle housing code issue. This is actually probably in all your housing code discussions. This raises some of the issues. So thanks to the folks at Copper West as well as Echo Northwest, we were able to get our hands on the regional multiple listing data. This chart before you is an aggregate of the 830 homes sold in Hood River over the past 3 years. And it takes into account the house sale price as related to unit size and the respective size of the dwellings. And so we're looking at this idea and this relationship of housing sale price as compared to size. And I've highlighted some of the issues when we started talking about MFI, the median family income for four, which in Hood River this year is $71,700. But what we start to look at and see is how quickly we get out of the 120% range when we get above 1,200 square feet. So that starts to reinforce this idea of the smaller dwelling units being really commensurate with the size, and in the idea of trying to promote a more affordable product also really has to do with scaling some of the size of the dwelling units that we do have. So as you can see in this chart, as we get over 2 bedrooms, which averages about 1,260 square feet on here, we really see this jump from 126% MFI to 150. And that actually starts to go back to relate to some of the unit size caps that we start thinking about in the middle housing code, trying to provide or focus those units in our market to those 120, 125% MFI ranges. Again, with the idea that we see this tension between larger dwelling units and the goal of promoting affordability.
Dustin?
Again, yes.
I just wanted to point out on that chart too, that what I noticed is that, this is 3 years worth of data, and the 2 largest categories are 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom houses. That's the largest numbers that have sold. So that's what's being built on the open market. So, it's kind of that category is already taken care of, so to speak. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the, part of the code emphasis is again is to try to backfill those other smaller dwelling units that the market is not necessarily embracing right now. So if you have any questions on that, I'm going to move into code, but I thought that was something that was really, it's going to be useful for our housing conversations, not only in this code, but also as you move through your other housing efforts. So, for this, just to kind of bring us back up to speed, on January 19th, staff provided and presented a revisited code to our planning commission. And as you heard before, we received input from various local builders and developers, including Mike Kettler of IBC, Greg Crafts, Nancy Roach, Mike Kitts and Beveridge. Nancy was kind enough to kind of gather their input as well. We sent some submissions to Eli Spivak, who some of you may have seen make the missing middle housing presentation here a couple years back. Joe Sager of Sager Design Build has been kind enough to actually start doing some drawings and work with us regarding the housing question, or excuse me, the height question. He is a local builder, a smaller builder, but also has been a pretty, he's done some smaller format infill projects that are starting to test some of our previous conventions. So a lot of these folks have been willing to submit some time and energy into testing this code, and also doing some critical analysis of the market's willingness and ability to embrace it. So during the public hearing, we did hear from a couple folks, some of those who I've been working with on the code, and they still express their concern over their ability to deliver some of these smaller units intended to promote some more compact development. Their concern is not only with the code, but also really made increased by the really expensive cost of our land and limited supply. So with that, the Planning Commission delivered the code and discussed some of those issues. And we'll continue to work with our development community as well on this. So although Planning Commission in their meeting didn't reach a final code recommendation to submit to City Council, it started to increase its discussion on additional amendments and options to increase the number of units that would be allowed, and including lowering the rate or the dwelling to area ratio, considering a flat rate of landscaping instead of the lot area coverages, and started talking about a code methodology that would further incentivize the smaller dwelling units. These amendments, as prepared, are included in your packet. The chart that I provided in your packet provides a bit of a side-by-side shortcut in the comparison of the existing code, my first draft or the staff draft, as well as some of the revised amendments that are being developed right now. I just want to be clear that these revisions to be presented to PC have not been deliberated, but they're coming out of the discussions that we're having with our stakeholders, as well as the Planning Commission discussions. And also coming out of the concern that this marketability concern that we've been talking about, with the intent of having a more progressive approach to smaller dwelling units to try to offset some of that marketability issue. So based tonight, on your input tonight, I will make more revisions to the code, and I'll present that before Planning Commission for discussions. And so, and out of those discussions, we should expect some additional refinements before this comes to City Council. So again, the purpose is to get your direction on these pending amendments that are outlined in the chart, including any preferences, concerns, or support that the council has relating to this methodology to lower the area ratio, to look at landscaping to be used in lieu of the lot coverage, and again, to look at a new methodology on how we measure height. So, any questions before we dig into a couple topics?
Dustin, could you clarify the, in this chart right here, the parking requirements for R1, is that a typo that it's now 2
Oh, yes,
parking spaces?
the R1 got reversed. It should be 211. Currently, right now, you require 2 spaces per dwelling unit. The draft code recommended 1, which we discussed with you, and that's not changing. So that actually is just got flipped.
Okay, thank you.
And Gladys, did you have a question?
I had the same question.
Oh, the same question. Okay.
Yeah, it's two now, 1 proposed and in the first draft and 1 still recommended.
I do want to earlier there was a gal, Nancy Roach, who came on and she, she talked about heights and open space and common open space, and there's already existing housing that's similar, that, there's parking in the back. When do we ask those questions? Because I want to learn more of those issues that builders are bringing up and how we can be a better partner to meet these needs.
Well, we're gonna touch on a couple of them tonight.
Okay.
Oh, but what you'll have is you'll have a full code review post Planning Commission recommendation. So Planning Commission will deliberate on a lot of these issues, or have deliberated, and will continue to deliberate. And as we will develop a whole code set that has the recommended changes. So based on public input.
So I just had a quick question about that. Normally, sounds like counselors aren't in those conversations, but I feel that I would learn a lot by just hearing. So is that, are the rules are that it goes to planning and we can't be a part of that conversation, or can we join these meetings?
Absolutely. This is not, this is a legislative hearing. So it's not like when we have a quasi judicial hearing where you have to wait till the end to have your input. You're absolutely welcome to be immersed in the Planning Commission part and to watch that be made.
Okay, thank you.
But I don't think it's not a council discussion. It's a Planning Commission discussion, but we could listen to it.
Yeah, I'll be a fly on the wall. I just want to hear more.
And that's part of the reason why you've seen me so often here, is to keep bringing back that feedback loop so that you don't have to wait till the end, so that when this does come before you as the ultimate decision maker, you will have some background and hopefully a better understanding of how did we get here.
So I have a question. Did the information that Heather Staten submitted into our packet regarding height and fourplexes and maximum area, I think, versus floor area ratio, plus all the comments that Nancy Roach made today and in her comments that she sent us, were those comments all discussed by the Planning Commission at the last meeting, or has all this come in the meantime?
Some of it they provided ahead of time. So some of it was provided directly to Planning Commission last time.
But not all of it.
Well, there will be both. So I don't think we do a final consensus on on all of them. So I think some of their comments are pending resolution. So
Pending resolution means Planning Commission hasn't fully discussed it, so they haven't made a finding on which way they would want to go on those questions yet?
correct.
Okay.
Now, some of them, Planning Commission did give me direction, or I started getting some consensus without final, and some of those will be are reflected in these revisions to be presented back to PC. So the idea that, like for example, the landscape element, that comes directly from some of the comment and some of the consensus that Planning Commission did arrive at. The idea that we would have different heights on corner lots, that came out of, some of these things are being very much born out of that Planning Commission feedback.
I guess the things that aren't, so some of the things that came out of the feedback, it feels appropriate that we would be talking in general terms about those tonight. But the things that they haven't fully fleshed out, like floor area ratio versus maximum height area ratio. If they haven't gone through that yet and they're like, well, maybe floor area ratio is the way to go, I'm not sure that we should be discussing that if they haven't really fleshed it out yet. I guess I'm not sure how. It seems a little bit backwards in that way. If there's additional things they haven't discussed yet on that, because they're the ones that usually gets in the weeds on it. That's what I'm saying.
Justin, I think it would be helpful to go through the items specifically that you're looking for feedback on to inform the Planning Commission discussion. So those are the higher level policy questions that you need some feedback on.
Okay.
Yeah, we're right there. So the three that you have, the three issues that we have right now are really some of the biggest drivers to outcomes. When we talk about the unit to site area, this is a high level issue and one of the main drivers to outcome. And so that's why it's one of the first I want to talk about tonight. Some of the, you have before you on here, what your code looks like now under the current code, the draft code that we submitted, as well as some of the revisions based on the Planning Commission feedback. Typically, your R1 lots now are one dwelling unit plus one dwelling unit per ADU. And the initial draft would now allow 2 dwelling units on a standard lot, such as this, or up to 6 dwelling units for a cottage cluster, and that would be about 15,000 square feet. So, excuse me, here's the first, this is your R1, 7,000 square feet, one house. That's the unit. Proposed code, approximately 2 dwelling units on a lot. And once we started getting into that code, we started capping the unit size. So the discussion of 1,100 square feet for a unit without a garage becomes discussed, as well as 1,500 square feet for a unit with a garage. They're kind of going back to that first slide that I talked about of promoting a smaller dwelling unit and aiming that or targeting that towards your entry level houses. The subsequent revision that you see here allows not only a detached unit, but also an attached unit. So the idea of the dwelling units are approximately the same. It's just the configuration becomes a little more, it becomes more flexible in the configuration on how these units look. Things become a little more dynamic when we get into R2. R2 currently allows 2 dwelling units on a 5,000 square foot site. Here's our visual. The initial code that was drafted changed that or proposed that would be allowed 1 dwelling unit for every 1,500 square feet. So that would change that to 3 units on a site of like size, again with a unit size cap to really require smaller units or without the larger units to be developed. Discussion came with a revision that would further incentivize the smaller dwelling units or those 800 square feet to be built at 1 for every 1,200 square feet. So now we're looking at a subsequent revision that starts to provide even more incentive for the smallest dwelling units on a same site, increasing the number of units that can be built from initially what was 2 units per acre, now up to 4 units per, or excuse me, 2 units per site, up to 4 units per site on an R1 lot.
R2, right?
In R2. And
R2, okay.
R3 and C1 also follow a similar methodology because they essentially have the same very similar site development requirements as the R2 zone now. So the same philosophy would go to R3 and C1, allowing more smaller units than at a rate greater than larger units. So that's kind of a general philosophy of not all dwelling units, regardless of size, are allowed.
Does this allow stacking, Dustin, or could you have the, it would look sort of like the first picture, but they'd be 2 per rectangle?
It's attached and detached. So it could, they
Can be attached vertically as well as horizontally then, I guess. Okay.
yes. Yep. To a certain limit, and we'll talk about that in the height calculation on why that is. But vertical, this would allow vertical stack. I would not expect that to get a whole lot of favor because of really from the development community and their desire to divide these up and to sell them. But we're not preempting that. I would expect there to be more ground level units just out of their based on the feedback that we've received from the Home Builders Association as well as the builders. So I'm hoping that went to the next screen. So the draft code has been developed to incentivize a greater number of smaller units with incentives to have them over the large format. Before we go into landscaping and height, I'd like to take any council direction or its preference on this progressive idea of more smaller units at greater ratios. And I'll incorporate that into the revised drafts for legislation before Planning Commission review on Monday.
Did those drawings reflect the 70% coverage, lot coverage instead of the 50%?
No, they didn't. That'll be the next one. So we'll work at what the landscape looks like in area coverage.
Jessica, did you have a comment?
I was just curious, Dustin, if you did or if the Planning Commission did talk about the idea of the floor area ratio.
They didn't dive into it too much. We did get those comments, but they didn't discuss the floor to area ratio as the methodology.
Okay.
Do you think they will next time?
We can. I don't know if it got too much traction because it's such a departure from how we evaluate them now. If we want to evaluate them side by side, this is kind of what the current code looks at. We do essentially have a floor to area ratio. We just base it on currently now on coverage and height. So you can limit we limit the amount of coverage on a lot and we cap the height. That essentially becomes the metrics of floor to area. So we do get at it, we just don't express it in the terms of FAR.
I'd like to have it looked at more thoroughly if we could, just in general terms. But let's go ahead with this discussion. That's just an aside. Gladys?
It says question. So this is over, or you still have more to share with us?
Nope, that's just part one. And I'm looking for feedback on just the idea of this more progressive approach to zoning an area, that smaller units are able to be built at lesser area rates.
Tim? And then Megan?
So Dustin, you had mentioned that that the edited, updated code revisions are going to incentivize smaller units. Can you explain what that part of it? I can see how it will allow more units. I'm not sure how it's incentivizing it.
Well, part of the code will allow a greater number of units to be built on a piece of real estate. The code itself is process preference to smaller units, so it allows a non-discretionary land use approval, or some people would call it an expedited land or an expedited permit review. That's a procedural benefit to doing this. As we get into the next pieces, it will also allow for more of the lot itself to be developed in terms of preferential treatment for smaller units to be able to use a larger amount of the lot itself. So
Do you have some indication that it's actually, I mean, incentivizing it means to me that, you know, somehow it's as profitable or more profitable to build the units being smaller the way that the code is than not. Is that true? Have you looked at that?
yeah, I'm going to have a couple developers provide me a pro forma on one over another before I come back to you. The turnaround from the last planning commission to now was not enough time for them to do that, but I will have a couple pro formas. So when I speak to incentives, I'm definitely not speaking to a monetary incentive.
You're talking about just having more houses being able to be built.
Yeah, a regulatory incentive.
Seems more like a regulatory allowance to me than an incentive, but.
Yeah, well, I guess as compared to the baseline when it's not permitted, like that would be, I guess that's where we're starting from. So not permitted. So
But it's only an incentive if it actually means something monetarily. Other than that, it's typically not.
I think it's just that they get more units, so they make more money. You know, if we can only sell 2 houses on that lot, then we get X amount. If we can sell 3 or 4 houses on that lot that cost us $300,000 to start with, then it's an incentive.
It could be an incentive, just as long as it's as profitable to do it.
Right, exactly, yeah. Usually more front doors is more profitable, but I'll leave that up to the developers. That's their that's their thing. Anything else, Tim?
No, I think Mark had his hands up.
Yeah, and Megan did too. So I was going to go to Megan next. I think she had her hand up, and then Mark.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so I guess big picture, more smaller houses is absolutely what I'm looking for out of the missing middle code. You know, with what Kate said of the mechanism to get there, I don't know enough about it to say that maximum unit is better or different than the floor area. I do, you know, in Heather's letter mentioning the more non-conventional lot sizes, you know, kind of limit, like the current mechanism potentially limiting the number of units is a concern for me. I'm going to just throw this out there, but is there a reason we've got like a maximum unit versus a minimum unit? Because I'm certainly aiming to get as many houses as we can versus limiting the number.
On the minimum, there's a minimum unit set on there at 2. Really, that starts to reflect the change from one full dwelling unit in R1 to more than one, which is a change. The upper limit has to do with these developments being permitted outright. So no land use process, no public process, or discretionary land use review or notice. So the idea of putting a cap on there limits the general size of these developments. And it also is targeted towards more of an infill project rather than large format, to where you may experience more of a request or desire to have a community or public facing process. These will be permitted. The intent in the code is written for them to be permitted, subject to building permit, no public or notice. So that's part of the reason why the upper cap. But there is definitely space if there was a minimum threshold. You know, there's reasons to promote that as well. It's something I thought about. It's definitely in council's purview to set that. I would just hate to miss the 2 unit opportunity, because if we had a too small unit that we're looking at in the R1.
And I mean, just to say it, we already have 2 units in the R1, so to speak, because you can do an ADU. So, I mean, it just could be done differently, but I mean, people may think, oh, this is a huge change, but it's just making it easier for people to be able to do it. But we do allow 2 units right now with the ADU. So,
It's,
Mark? Go ahead, Mark.
So same goals as Megan, little different direction though. If the developers were able to put, get a 3-bedroom into, 1,300 square feet, can they squeeze the balloon that way? So you have 2 units, but one's 1,300 and one's, 900, or some such mix. But being able to, we saw in that data that there's pretty high demand for 3-bedroom stuff. And it seems to me that you could get a 3-bedroom, decently small footprint, almost about where in the range that we're talking about, with the goal of, 125%-ish, like you said. So that would be one thing I would wonder if you could look at. And then I was also thinking that, we're talking about giving them more flexibility, which I think is good. But these aren't the development stuff isn't the only incentive package. We'll talk at some point about other carrots that might, if we get close, it might push it over if we can add, SDC or some other benefits that get close. So I don't know that our goal needs to be that it has to be a Excel sheet, benefit for this just from the development side. So that's something. And then lastly, I'd like to see the cartoons once we get through with this discussion, sort of seeing the pictures like you showed last time. What's the difference between the 50% coverage and 70% coverage? Because compatibility with neighbors is still going to be a big thing that I'd love. I don't want to trade that completely off against more units, because I think that it's going to be a splitting motion. I'm hoping that we can find the combination of compatibility and more units. So, thank you.
Others? Comments on the numbers that Dustin has given us tonight? Eric?
Yeah, I think I would just echo Mark's very last comment about the compatibility. As this discussion proceeds, to me, that's an very important topic. And one way maybe that gets split up is maybe there's less of this kind of densification in R1 and more of it in the areas that were sort of meant to be that way in our zoning, which is R2 and R3. But I'll be very interested in how the discussion proceeds.
I'll go. And then others. I think that the denser numbers are better, just in general. I'd like to see the pro formas that the builders are going to get us, because I think that's the proof's in the pudding. And if it doesn't work for them, they're not going to build it. All this that we're doing is for naught. So we need to get feedback from them to find out what they will do. Does it work or not? And they're pretty dang creative, being able to, doing all that stuff at Katie's Way along that stream, and Joe Sager's new developments he's doing. I mean, the thing that, I can't remember who built it, but it was Joel Knudsen did on a very skinny little lot, an up and down unit. Beautiful, beautiful place on a very small lot. And it's really done nicely and looks good. So I am for higher density in general, however we can make it happen, as long as the builders are saying, yeah, we will build that if you let us. Others? Gladys?
Yeah, Kate, I love the way that you phrased all of it. I will echo every word that you said. I really feel that I am not well informed to make some of these decisions of like, I think this is going to work well. I really want to send this back to our planning and to have developers who have already done this, such as Doug, such as Mike, such as everyone else that Kate mentioned, and really would feel much more confident making a decision knowing that they've already given their perspective before we make our final.
Others?
I'll just say that I was fine with the revisions that you showed us tonight, Dustin.
Megan?
I'm probably going to just be echoing Kate and Gladys, but yeah, I think it's super important, and I'm really excited that Dustin has been getting input from actual builders to see if this code will work and will result in things. I really don't want us to end up in a situation like the ADU thing where we over-regulate and try to protect our neighborhoods from something and then just have a blockade for 10 years and get nothing done. If we're doing this, and it's super important because we absolutely need all of these housing units to be built. I want us to get to a point where they were actually going to get built. And that is absolutely my top priority. So thank you, Dustin.
I think that definitely gives me the direction I need on part one in terms of my revisions and markup to Planning Commission. So thank you. Next step, another middle code revision or one of the adjustments came to the lot area coverages and some of the open space requirements for the cottage and middle housing. Currently, you have no landscape requirements for your single family dwellings, duplexes, or individual townhouses. And we rely on a lot coverage requirement that caps the amount that you can dedicate to building parking lots and driveways. So after our initial code discussion with Planning Commission with the draft that included a unit by unit dedication of private space, common open space, lot coverage standard, open space requirement, Planning Commission rep gave me some feedback that it really was more favorable to a simplified approach to where we used the site area landscaping in lieu of the lot coverages. And the recommendation that I'm going to go back with is based upon the planned unit development requirements, where the amount of area is dedicated. So right now we rely on a 30% flat rate, and I will prepare some standards that go along with that in regards to the amount of yard area and setback requirements that would be required. Really trying to boil this into clear and objective standards. That's one of the very much of one of the guiding principles is we need clear and objective standards for these if we're going to just move to permit on them. So essentially that becomes tree counts, shrub counts, and we'll have some incentive in there as mathematical as possible for the preservation of existing trees. So like a PUD, these sites will also be evaluated at a whole, not on an individual lot by lot basis. And if you look at the code, or excuse me, at the two blocks, the 8-bit blocks in your slide, that's the difference in the delta between the upper site is an R1 site with its existing 48% maximum coverage. The bottom represents a 30% landscape area to some extent, which is about a 22% change between the two. That's probably that's the largest change in our, is reflected in the R1 zone. It's the most restrictive zoning now. And if it went to a flat site or a flat rate of landscaping, you see the largest delta. And that's kind of really almost the scale representation of what 22%, or excuse me, what 48% and what 70% looks like on a site.
Megan?
Justin, did you say like current PUDs are meeting this 30% landscape requirement?
Yeah, current PUD is 30%.
Okay, so like Stella Lane or Katie's Lane.
That's what they would.
That's what those would look like in real life.
Yeah, that's what the standard that those were charged against were.
The co-housing development was the same way?
Co-housing was actually less because it's a multifamily. Co-housing was not required to meet a a 30%. They were required to meet, I believe, 20%, but it far by exceeded it just by virtue of including the Adams Creek as well as.
Oh, okay.
So it was held to a lesser standard, but it exceeded that standard by way of amount of landscaping and open space dedicated to it.
Okay. And
So-
when you say we don't have a landscaping requirement right now, it just means you put in your house, you get your building permit, and build the house, and then if the whole thing's gravel, the whole thing's grass, the whole thing's weeds or blackberries, it doesn't matter. There is no code that says you have to do anything other than you might have some street trees required by your sidewalk area. That's it. You could just let the whole thing be dirt if you wanted to. But this code says, no, you can't do that. You've got to landscape it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's the exchange of, we're not going to limit a code. So your previous example would say, but you cannot build the whole thing or use parking. We're going to cap it in this instance at 40%. And whatever happens to the rest of it is the rest of it. This one is looking kind of at it from a different perspective, saying you need to put in 30% landscaping, and that's the requirement. So rather than the individual lot coverage.
Jessica?
Because it has to be 30% landscaped, then it doesn't take into account the like slopes and natural areas, like wetlands that Nancy mentioned. Is that true?
That could be included in the calculation.
Would that be part of the 30% landscape required or not, because it's not landscaped? Like you could landscape a slope, but not a wetland.
You could leave it undisturbed. I mean, I think that's one of the provisions in the code that we were going to clarify is could wetlands and sloped areas that remained undisturbed or environmentally constricted be counted towards a common open space or an open space requirement. I think that started losing favor when we started getting away from this idea of common open space and just saying, this is how much landscape area you have to have. So it's in order to simplify it.
I would be in favor of, and I know it's getting complicated. I'm probably not understanding it all, but I would be in favor of encouraging people to include the slopes and wetlands in their open space. I don't know if that means landscaping. And I also, Mark kind of said this a little bit, but it does seem like I feel like that the 70% lot coverage looks like it would be difficult to integrate with the neighborhoods if we're mostly talking about infill development. And I recognize that that's what's allowed right now in PUDs. But I have to admit, I'm not super excited about the 70% block on the screen.
Yeah, I can show you what this looks like in the R. I have R2 and R3 as well. So in the R2 context, the difference between what your lot, what your maximum lot coverage looks like is in the upper left. It's essentially 50-50, 50% coverage, 50%. It's not landscape area. It's not parking lot, not not driveway, and not house. So your patios, your decks under 4 feet, your gravel can all be in excess of that. And to the lower part is what 70% looks like, essentially on a 5,000 square foot lot. For all
I just want to throw something out here on this because we're talking about the percentages here, and I like the way that green looks. That looks wonderful. More green, the better, of course. But when we get these pro formas back, and they may say we can't do this unless it's 70. that we can cover and 30% landscaping. So it's really hard for me to say, oh, I want more green when we don't know if that's going to work for the developers. And there's another way it can work for the developers, what we haven't even talked about. And if we go higher, then we don't have to take up as much space. But we're talking about, 25 or 28 feet. If you let them have another story, then they can maybe do something more creative, and we could have more green space. So I'm just, I've always talked when I was on planning commission, do you want more lot coverage or do you want more height? If it doesn't pencil, we've got to potentially talk about one or the other. So just keep that in mind while we're discussing this. Mark?
Yeah, I'm wondering about enforcement of landscaping and definition of landscaping and how that would be done. So can everything be patio pavers and that's landscape? Or does it, and how do we know, how do we manage that, I guess is the question.
Really, I would say the most clear objective way is to require planting rates. That we count trees and we count shrubs.
As part of the inspection process in the building thing.
Prior to certificate of occupancy, those would need to be required to be installed. No different really than the way that we deal with street trees right now. When we have an inspection, the street trees have to be installed. If it's not at a time when it's seasonally favorable for that, like if we're in the middle of high wind in July, we'll take a bond and we'll hold that money until it's installed, and then we'll release the bond.
So our expectation is that other outside spaces, patios and porches and such are within the 70%?
We would clarify that. So it's, within the what does the landscape look like? We would clarify essentially in what will qualify clearly.
Thank you.
But hard surface is usually lot coverage area, not landscaping, correct? Because it's
patio. The difference would be a hard surface parking space would be lot coverage. A hard surface patio would not be lot coverage.
okay.
So that's an important distinction though, because that would be something we would absolutely need to have clarified of what counts and what does not count.
Tim?
Thanks, Mayor. So it seems like we're increasing the impervious surface a lot, right? Has there been any thought to having the landscape be low impact development and have some type of eye towards mitigating the stormwater runoff in any sense?
Yeah, actually the first draft code, the first 3 provisions encourage LID for the purposes of low mitigation. It's the first thing. They're not requirements because we don't have a full stormwater management manual, but they are the first 3 things that are mentioned in the first version of the draft code was to encourage the use of low impact technologies, natural technologies to mitigate stormwater.
When we're moving to a situation where we have 70% lot coverage, it might actually behoove us to require it as opposed to encourage it. And so what I'm hearing you say, Dustin, is that we can't require it until we have that manual. Is that correct?
Well, we will require stormwater mitigation by vehicle of LI. We don't have a formalized LID vehicle yet that I could look to and saying, here's the final engineering standards of LID.
Mm-hmm.
So the developers will have to mitigate for stormwater. The method, we want to encourage them to do it in LID. So.
Well, it has real implications, right? By increasing the lot coverage that much in our stormwater system, potentially.
Well, they will have to mitigate for it. So, I mean, there's still the requirement to treat stormwater prior to the release.
Right, but you know, I'm looking at the thin green line around the white space there, and I'm not seeing a stormwater retention pond there.
Correct. Yeah, if you were to go 70%, most likely you're not getting a surface pond. You would be doing some other treatment for control, deeper vault. With the density or intensity of that, you're probably looking at more of a structure, less of an LID system. If you wanted to meet the max, or if you wanted to just do the minimum landscape requirement.
Thanks, Dustin.
Megan?
Yeah, this might be more opinion than question, but I guess I'm hearing from some folks that these boxes on the screen look scary. And from my end, knowing what our actual PUDs look like on the ground and in real life, like I'm perfectly comfortable with this 30% requirement. And they in real life feel far more comfortable and have already been built in R1s and seem like they fit pretty well. So I think if we're trying to do things that are PUDs without having all the requirements of PUD, trying to match PUD standards is perfectly reasonable.
I live next to a new development that Joe Sager's doing, and he's building right now. Also, the ADU we just built is next to 2 PUDs, one on each side of the alley, and I'm fine with the amount of lot coverage for those. So I'm okay with the 70%. Others?
Well, if I could just kind of like briefly follow up, and my comments about stormwater are not necessarily whether I like it or not. I think that there are very real implications associated with having that amount of impervious surface on a lot. So it's not, you know, whether I like it or not. It's actually kind of a real physical consequence of that. And, you know, I think Dustin's answer covered my concerns in that somehow that runoff is going to have to be mitigated.
And it did before too, Dustin, on the PUDs. It had to be mitigated on those PUDs too, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. Other thoughts, anyone? Eric?
I guess I do agree with Councilor Saunders that the market has a way of making things nice, because that's what the market needs to do. And because I am pretty scared by the gray box, and not just the stormwater issue that Tim raises, but just kind of livability and high density. If we don't have a good park plan, and I know we believe we do, but if we don't have a good park plan, I'm reminded of my trip to San Francisco right before COVID, where it was all houses everywhere, no parks anywhere, and just concrete. And I just don't know that that's Hood River. So I am candidly a little scared by that gray box. I like Megan's point about the market will probably aid that. And go, thanks for getting rid of it off the screen. But whether it's on the screen or not, it just worries me about density a bit. So anyway, we do have a livability factor here. And, you know, we also have a circumstance where Portland's sort of exploding. We have all these people potentially coming out here. I'm also thinking, who's going to buy these? And are we up densifying for someone other than our community? I'm not sure. But anyway, I have not taken any firm positions on all this because, like some others said, I feel like I've really got to get smarter on these technical land use issues before I start taking any firm positions. But that's what I had to say.
Anyone else? I think you've pretty much gotten feedback from everyone, Dustin. Kind of a mixed review, but
Yeah, that one is a mixed, more mixed bag. So we're going to proceed with that and let Planning Commission do its work.
okay.
I'm going to try to bring back my my presentation that I shut down mid. Sorry, Commissioner or Councilor Haney. I didn't mean to shut you off there. So.
That's all right. Hey, I've been called a commissioner twice this meeting, so maybe I'm due for a promotion. No, just kidding.
I think that got contagious. That got contagious quickly. Excuse me while I get to our. So the last one was is R3, and I think my screen sharing is paused. Hopefully you can see the screen again.
Yep.
Okay. So this is the instance of now of R3, which looks pretty similar. As I mentioned, the R1 was going to have has the biggest delta. The R3 has about a 7% delta between what R3 looks like today to the upper, my upper right and to the lower. So that's kind of your delta between the two. Relatively small in that respect. So this was where I was going to ask questions or your comments regarding landscaping, but you, well, we're not shy. So thank you for getting to that. The last issue that we're going to look at is the building height development standard. This is one you heard about earlier in regards to some of the concerns that were expressed about the proposed building size. Part of the issue in the look of the code had to do with looking at a new methodology for compact housing. Our current code has some serious issues when it comes to trying to implement compact development, when it comes to how clear the code is written in terms of ability to administer it, the expectation of developers, the expectation and review of staff. The current code also allows or has some issues when it comes to building on slopes and some pretty different results that can occur between the size of the units. And it also relies on the development to be measured from the pre-development conditions, which presents some real issues when it comes to trying to build a multiple unit in a compact way with multiple buildings, where these units rely on shared stormwater facilities or stormwater drainage, oftentimes shared parking areas, shared utilities, and shared driveways. So if we're looking at pre-development conditions on sites that really need to be balanced in order for them to work as a unit, pre-development conditions really lead to some difficulties when it comes to actually designing these things. And I haven't heard this so much from the development community, but I will, or I would, based on some of these issues, and just based as a code administrator, those are some of my concerns. When we looked at, this is a side-by-side on how our code is administered now. To the left is how we currently administer the code. 28 feet is the stated height requirement in R1, R2, R3 zones, and then up to 35 feet in C1. We measure on a slope site from the high side, or we measure on a slope that has more than 10 feet, 10 feet up from the lowest point, which results and can result in a 38-foot building height. This shows and presents an issue not only for scale and compatibility, but this also results in an issue for some advanced firefighting and response. A building that has 3 stories, and this would end up and does end up, as you've noticed across town, as a 3-story building. We require some extra access points and a 26-foot wide drive lane to access and respond to these emergency responses in these locations. So the height issue becomes a buildability concern on infill, especially when we don't have these houses up to the street. When we have some of these cottage clusters and they don't have frontage requirements, they're removed from the street, we could end up essentially using our entire lot site to accommodate a fire truck turnaround and access.
So on Serpentine, there's 3 tall houses, another one currently going in. And so this applies to those homes, this 28 feet on the high side, and then the tall on the low side?
Those all have the frontage onto the street? Oh, yes. Yes, it would.
It does, okay, all right. So they're 3 stories on the downhill side,
Correct.
okay.
And you'll notice in your travels across town, those lots that sit uphill that are, I would call them typically on the south side of the road, you could notice an apparent mass and change based on that. They have the view lots. They also take advantage of this height, and you'll see them, you see them a lot on the Eugene, Hazel, Serpentine, those infill lots. You will notice those are technically built, in many of them, to 28-foot tall standards, and you can see what 28-foot can look like on a slope lot. So the response to that is really coming up with a code methodology that is fitted towards the middle housing. And in this code that shows kind of really, it reflects the right to the right here, a 25-foot building height max to the ridge, but now measured not from an average grade. So the idea of trying to take the average lot grade to limit these to 2 stories, not 3 stories, and to be responsive to some of those scale issues, as well as some of our responder issues. The code also calls into, and specifies different roof types, including the flat roof, as well as the shed roof at different height requirements. Also with the goal of allowing a 2-story development, but not a 3-story development. With the way that we measure in Hood River, there is very much a reason why we don't see pitched roofs on some of our townhouses. When we measure to the ridge or the highest point, you end up with a flat roof. I mean, that's a pretty common result. And you can see that pretty common result playing out in our built environment. So what we did here, and this is kind of how it looks at the code, we did hear from the development community and are still hearing from the development community that limiting this height is going to make for a challenge in allowing them to go vertical and allowing for more units to go vertical. And that's where that tension and balance becomes an issue. So what we've done, and in response to that, is on the corner sites, there's now a revision that suggests a 3-story on a corner. A 3-story or a corner or 28 feet will allow our first responders to use both street accesses, the front and the side, to respond and provide access. It's also on the compatibility side, you're not going to end up with a building size or a 28-foot measurement that is against someone's house, within 5 feet or 6 feet of a neighboring dwelling. So it also responds to that scale and compatibility issue. Yeah, some of the, and so we looked at, that's really how we're adjusting that now. Looking at some of the alternatives to housing height, having some exhibits, and I think you may have been provided some of the exhibits that we were looking at via email from the public in trying to dial in what is the appropriate height requirement, what is permissible, and what kind of fits into that sweet spot of buildability as well as compatibility and scalability. So
Gladys,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Dustin. Did you have
Oh
something?
yeah, I'm ready for any
Okay, all right.
questions and comments.
Gladys?
So I just want to make sure that I understood that last piece correct. What I heard, or what I think I heard, was the reason there is a limit on the height right now is because we need to make sure that we're leaving appropriate space for emergency vehicles to have access in and out of these potentially very high dwellings. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, you buzzed at the last part. I think it was Well, that's part of the reason is when you end up with a third story, there becomes a increased requirement for fire protection that we're trying to kind of match the limited access and the depth and the cluster development and those compact small infills with probably some real limitations that would prevent that. So,
But this is something that you'll take back to the builders, and you guys are going to have another conversation around how we can better partner to meet this height requirement.
yeah, we're going to continue to look at it, but I guess I was looking for council direction on what do you feel about the methodology? Do you have any input on the heights? Because I know you've also been approached on and asked for some of this narrowing of the gap. Is there?
So what I specifically want to say about height is that it exists. We've seen it in other cities. And so if it means more houses that we're going to be able to build more, I'm okay going up and to look at other models that we could replicate, customize to fit Hood River and replicate. So we're not reinventing the wheel. But again, I feel that I don't have enough of that knowledge to guide you specifically in that. Thank you.
Anyone else? Megan, and then Mark.
I'm gonna probably ramble a bit, but Dustin, can you talk about, if the point is just to limit to 2 stories versus 3, but given you could have a flat lot that does one thing with, the 25 or 28 foot, and you can have this steep lot that does a completely different thing with the same standard. Is there not a simpler way to just say 2 stories?
That would be one approach, 2 stories. It just is what we would need to be real prescriptive about. What does that mean?
Okay.
A single story that ends up being 28 feet tall with a mezzanine and loft in it. So,
I mean, yeah, fine, there'd be limits, but I guess, I see your issues with methodology. I don't want to change them just for one type of building and not for all of them. But if to Gladys's point, if smarter people than me think the methodology is broken, then fine. In the scale of why we would be limiting the size of these developments we want to happen to be smaller than any other development that could happen on the same lot does feel weird to me. And certainly I have concerns that we've heard from multiple folks that you just can't get a second story out of this 25-foot limit, which severely restricts what can be done with the property. I definitely like that to be looked at more by folks that understand it better.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks. I like the proposal with the corner being taller. I like that you showed all the other forms. So I guess I don't really have a good feeling for how it competes with the other things that they could build on the same lot. Are we skewing it one way? And then the last thing I was just noodling on was if you have tall things on adjacent properties, it seems to me that we don't have it's a different issue with respect to compatibility. So can we allow even taller in places where it's not interfering, right? So if you I don't know, I don't have a good example, but if you have a lot in between 2 of these duplexes that are 30 feet tall, this should be allowed to be 30 whatever feet tall. So I don't know how you manage that, but it seems like there's some cleverness that could be done to have one set of rules if you're next to a 1-story building and another set of rules if you're next to a 3-story building.
I think the only issue with that, Mark, is there's so many old, really tiny, small, I guess I call them inadequate, functionally obsolete. That's what they call them in real estate. you know, built in the 1930s or 20s, not a well-built house that was old, but, you know, just a barely functioning house with no insulation and asbestos and the whole nasty everything. And it's like the one we own. And, you know, somebody's not going to spend, if they're going to buy that property, they're likely going to tear that house down. And then the house next to it's the same way. And then within the next 5 years, that's a 1-story. It's not going to be there either. So, I mean, you know, being compatible with something that's probably going to be torn down in 3 to 5 years is like, well, yeah, it might be compatible, but.
Well, to be clear, I'm saying that Dustin's proposal, actually the modification to the proposal is okay in any case. And then I'm saying, are there even cases beyond that where we can go +1?
Okay, I see what you're saying. All right. Gladys, did you have another comment?
No, I feel like you guys cleared that up on that last piece.
Okay.
I do just want to mention this, Dustin. I am very grateful and thankful, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing right now to just have these conversations with developers. I know it's, you know, a lot of time and effort, so just thank you so much for putting that time to really to bring this back to us. And I just unfortunately feel right now that there are still limitations that are too restrictive. I do not know the best solutions for those, so please continue to work with developers as you are. Again, just very grateful for your work. Thank you.
Jessica?
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I was just going to say that I support having it be a 2-story limit. And I don't have a good thought on the methodology. It sounds like you've got a lot of smart people working on that and trying to figure out what will actually work. But I do like the idea of the 2 stories. And I'm okay. You know, Mark's idea about if you got 3 stories on both sides, then allowing that. I'm okay with that too.
Eric?
One thought that comes to mind, that if we do adjust the height limit for a home, there undoubtedly are many people who've built their own existing homes based on some understanding about what the existing rules were at the time. So you could have obstructions of views that crop up. So part of this compatibility question would be, how do you deal with a new house that, because of the new rules, is going to block a view that otherwise wouldn't? We might hear from people on that. It would be kind of tilting the scales in favor of the new people rather than the people who built under the old set of rules. I realize you always have that to some degree, but 3-foot additional height could introduce risk to obstruction of views. So that's undoubtedly something Planning Commission will be thinking about as they deliberate these.
So-
The proposed things are to reduce the height, not expand the height, right?
Yes.
So we go in the opposite direction.
We're going, I'm sorry, but maybe I just misunderstood. You're saying we're lowering the height?
I mean, that's what the proposal
That's what the proposal is.
has been.
Okay, sorry, I must have misunderstood. That's not what I thought it was, so I apologize.
So we went from, I believe it used to be 33 or 35. Is that right, Dustin? I mean, I don't think you were planning director then, but I think it was
My house is 35 under old rules.
35. Okay, so we were at 35 and then we went to 28. So now we're asking about 25.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. Point
Yeah.
withdrawn.
Personally, I think it should be 28. I think it should stay the same as it is. I don't see a reason to change it to 25. I'm not for saying it needs to be 2 stories. I think we can get more housing if we say it can be 3. But I personally don't have to have all the houses look like cottages. Not that I don't love a cottage. I made my house try to look like, you know, a 1920s lap siding house, even though it was an old 1970s rancher. So I love that style. I love that look personally, but I also am okay with modern. I'm okay with flat roofs. I'm okay with shed roofs. And I think if we get really restrictive on all this, it's just going to limit more things of what can be done. So I don't have to have all of Hood River look like cottages personally. So I'm okay with leaving it at 28 feet, which it, you know, just seems it's more equitable to everything else. Gladys?
Kay, I love the way that you said that. That's exactly what I wanted to speak to. I've heard compatibility, what's compatible in the last couple minutes. And I think that we have to remember that we're trying to build equitable housing for those who are very oppressed and don't have housing at all. So when we say, what do we want Hood River to look like? We want it to be equitable and inclusive of everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status. So when I hear, what do I want Hood River to look like? Well, what it's looking like right now is not the Hood River that we're all talking about, because it does not include equitable living housing options for those with diverse socioeconomic statuses.
And I guess I want to add one thing onto Gladys. You know, this is not affordable housing that we're making. This is the missing middle. It's not subsidized, but if we can make it some less expensive and some smaller, there'll be a lot more opportunities for people to move up and move in that don't have those opportunities right now.
On that, I'm also going to say, if we could build a lot more, the chart Dustin showed us at the beginning of this was that 22 units had been built of one bedroom in the last, or have been sold in the last 3 years. Like that's basically nothing. Functionally, anyone who's trying to find a one bedroom, there is nothing available. That's a huge problem for our community and different housing family sizes.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you say, well, they're buying 3 bedroom because people want 3 bedroom, well, all they're building is 3 bedroom. So it's not like they have a whole lot of choices out there to buy a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom. So, you know, I think you say, well, that's because people are want it. Well, there's enough people that can afford it, that can move here, that want those 3 bedrooms, yes, but there's also people that want 1 and 2 bedrooms that it's not being built. Others, comments for Dustin? Tim?
I have a question. If somebody were to have like a shed roof and were to put solar panels on top of it, would that count as building height? If they were kind of like angled up?
That could be something that could be built in, is what is the limit. So certainly we could definitely have some sort of allowance for that. So right now the shed doesn't indicate that. And even on a pitched roof, you could have that indication. Although typically you don't breach the ridge on a solar install. We could definitely have allowances for solar install as a permitted height obstruction.
I think that would be a good idea. So is the reason why we're changing this is because it's broke? I kind of heard that it was kind of a fire or safety concern. Is that really the primary reason?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask, but certainly in the housing needs analysis, in our comp plan recommendation, there was a strategy to look at how do we measure height. I'm saying by first person practitioner, it's extremely difficult to do these measurements, and it's a constant source of dispute, if you will, between builders and staff. It's also in this instance not necessarily the best. It's not necessarily the methodology. So, you know, one thing is, you know, we may want to look at how do we measure height, whether it's 25 feet, whether it's 28. It's the idea of how's the philosophy of measurement? Because when we say it's a 28-foot height and it ends up being 38, that it's not necessarily the most it doesn't really translate. So I think we've identified issues with it to the point where thinking about it in a compact, frontage-free, smaller format development raises issues. So I wouldn't say it's broken. It has raised issues.
So is it true that using the methodology, you may not have actually a shorter building using the average slope?
I think in the methodology that's proposed, you end up with shorter building.
Interesting.
Would you move these height definitions to existing form allowances, single house on R1, 2 townhouses? I mean, why would it have to be a different answer to, what they can do on, without this cottage code and what they can do with?
Yeah, I think when the answer, yes, we could. That would be a different legislative ask, but I think going back to that housing needs, it didn't mention do this for middle housing code. It just addressed this as an issue in general for Hood River, the difficulty in administering clearly and objectively your methodology right now. So when we went from 33 to 28, we put in some language regarding slope sites that made it a little tricky to administer. So I think that was something that I think would be great to address.
So I think that you're talking about a few different things. Right now, we're talking about potentially changing the 28-foot height to 25 or 25 and 28 on corner lots. And this is just for middle housing. You've also mentioned the difficulty of administering the current code we have and how it reads, and there's some discrepancies and it's too vague. Then we've also talked about, or Mark just mentioned, the possibility of taking this code and applying it to the way we might interpret the code to our other zones, not middle housing. So I think we've got like 3 or 4 things that we're talking about. And so I'd like to try and focus us back on middle housing only. And I'm not saying those other things aren't really important, but we've kind of gotten astray here a little bit on all these other things too tonight, which is good discussion. That is great, but I think let's try and focus us back down on just this one thing here for the middle housing.
So I like the white column.
The what? The white column. Okay. All right. All right. And I think Gladys was on the green column. Is that right? Okay. The dark green column. Megan?
Yeah, I'd like the height to be the same as anything else you could build in that code.
Okay, so keep it the same, 28. Jessica?
I kind of had said the white column before, but I could go with the green.
Okay, so either way for you. Eric?
Yeah, I don't really have a constructive comment to provide here. Sorry.
That's okay. Tim?
I would go for keeping it the same, but I am also sensitive to Dustin's computational dilemma. So I'm interested to see if there isn't some other more clear-cut way to reduce the amount of conflict associated with making those decisions. So I'm not sure that that's terribly helpful. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see it as broke, other than the computational difficulties that Dustin's experiencing.
And which I think are just across the board, not necessarily just for this.
Right.
Yeah. Mark?
I still like the white column.
The white column. Okay. Well, you've got our input, Dustin. Had to laser us back in on it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. That's exactly what I needed. I will do some more code tweaking, take this to Planning Commission, who will deliberate more. We'll have some more community conversations, and this will come back to you all. Again, you will have the opportunity for a public hearing with the whole code, strikes and underlines, and all the pieces that come along with it as the legislative body. So please, if you have questions, you want to talk to me, you want to give input, I'm happy to go over it with you.
Thank you, everyone. All right, we're going to adjourn the work session, and I'm going to, I know it's after 9, but let's take 3 minutes, 3.